Joining our panel tonight, Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman in our center seat. Senator, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You gave a speech today about poverty. You are in a growing list of Republicans who have felt that they needed to get out on this issue. Paul Ryan, Marco Rubio, others. What is the message?
Well, first of all, we're in the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty, and things are worse, not better. In fact, poverty has increased during the last 4 years rather than improving. And so part of the message I gave today was, one, Republicans and all Americans ought to be focused on this issue. And second, we actually have some policies that have worked. We ought to build on those. I called it constructive conservatism in the sense that we know what works in terms of dealing with drug abuse and drug addiction. I've been involved in that for 20 years. We know what works in terms of prisoner reentry, dealing with this terrible cycle of recidivism where people get out of prison and within a few years they're back in again. Huge cost to the taxpayers, obviously helping to increase poverty and so many more broken families and broken communities because of it. So we talked about that and talked about the fact that, you know, there are proven policies that work and Republicans ought to be behind those and promoting them.
Jason?
Democrats between now and November would probably rather talk about anything other than Obamacare and the economy. Mm-hmm. So my question is, are you doing Republicans any favors by changing the subject? And not only changing the subject, changing it to something, poverty, income, inequality, that has traditionally been right in the wheelhouse of Democrats.
No, I think everybody cares about it and should, and I don't know if it's good or bad for the Republican Party, but it's good for the country for us to have an honest discussion about this. And you're right, income inequality has gotten a lot of discussion. What's gotten very little discussion is upward mobility. You know, why is there this persistent poverty? Why do we see 47 million Americans now below poverty? Why do we see among people who are in deep poverty probably historic numbers for our country? And part of the reason is so many of the programs that, you know, are well-intentioned here from Washington don't work. But there are better approaches, and the approaches I laid out today are approaches that take into account the fact that it's got to be bottom-up, not top-down. Ensure that those programs are in fact tested, that we use, you know, evidence-based research to determine what's the best way to do it, and require results and performance. And I talked about some very specific examples where if we don't deal with some of these issues, we're not going to get at some of the causes of poverty.
You also talked about drug addiction and incarceration. Mm-hmm. And the White House has also been talking about these issues in terms of sentencing policies, particularly with how they relate to drug offenses. And they have some allies in your colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle, in Rand Paul and Mike Lee and some others, who have said they're overly harsh, and some even call for moving in the direction of some states like Colorado with drug legalization. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I do think some sentencing reform is appropriate, but as I talked about today, I wish the President would join with us and deal with these issues in a more holistic way, instead of just saying we're going to allow people to leave the prison system because they are nonviolent drug offenders. Let's ensure that we do use some of these techniques and policies we talked about today. Diversion, where you get people who have a substance abuse problem to go into treatment with the alternative of incarceration. Drug courts, which work very well. So instead of simply saying we're going to have broad clemency and let a lot of people out of the prison system who are likely to be right back in it, you know, the data shows that 2/3 of those folks are likely to be back in the prison system within 2 or 3 years. Let's put in place policies that we know work, including the Second Chance Act, which I was the author of, that actually helps get people the treatment they need and also the job skills that they need to become productive members of society. So I think that's the better solution.
Senator, you had a non-controversial bill, bipartisan, that fell apart yesterday in a procedural squabble, the likes of which we've seen many times. Republicans have complained that the majority leader has shut them out of legislating. If the Republicans are in charge next year, what should they do to stay in charge, to keep their majority, and to help the Senate legislate again?
Look, I think we should open up the process and allow the people's voices to be heard. I did have a bill that I worked on for 3 years that I'd hoped could get through the process. It got out of committee. It's a strong bipartisan vote. It had co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. It made a lot of sense. It was on energy. What we were asking for was to have a few amendments, 4 or 5 amendments that were energy related, to be debated as part of that bill.
Including Keystone.
Including Keystone Pipeline, which is something that, you know, most Americans think we ought to approve. I certainly think it's long overdue to have that approved. So we had hoped for a good debate on energy issues, including energy efficiency, which was the core of the bill, and a good common sense bill that says the least expensive energy is actually the energy that we don't use, that we can save. But we were not able to do so because this town has become so dysfunctional that we aren't even allowed to have a debate on energy issues when we're debating an energy bill. So I hope that we can still get back to that. But when Republicans...
So you would want open amendment process under a Republican majority?
Look, I think you said to be able to keep the majority. I don't know what's the best thing to do politically. I think Democrats have determined that it's better not to allow votes on amendments because it makes their members vote on tough issues. My view is that that's what we're hired to do, and the American people expect that. You know, if the American people knew the fact that there have only been something like 8 Republicans amendments voted on since July, I think they'd be shocked.
Sure.
So I think we should open up the process more.
I wanted to go back quickly to the things you were talking about with Jason, specifically poverty, inequality, mobility. As you're well aware, the president is campaigning hard for an increase in the minimum wage. So far, the Senate has not been able to come to terms on that issue. There's been talk of some sort of a compromise. First of all, where do you stand on the importance of that within the broader picture of dealing with income inequality? And secondly, what would you like to see, what do you think could be done in the Senate to come out with a compromise on that issue?
Well, I don't like what the president's proposed. It's 10-10. I think it's too high and too fast, and I think it will result in just the opposite of what he apparently hopes for, which is more jobs. I hope that's what he's trying to do, because all the studies show, including from the Congressional Budget Office, that by raising it that high and that fast, you're going to result in fewer jobs being created. CBO says we lose 500,000 jobs. Other studies have different numbers, but pretty much all of them come down to the point that right now, because half the people on minimum wage are young people between 16 and 24, and because for many of them it's getting on that first rung of the economic ladder, that if you increase it too fast and too high, you're going to result in fewer jobs, not more jobs. And so for the very people who were trying to get into the workforce, dealing with not just high unemployment numbers, but as you know, Chuck, very high numbers of people who have dropped out of the workforce altogether, really at historic levels for men back to the 1940s, men and women combined back to the 1970s. We should be putting out policies that add jobs, not to put more pressure on employers to reduce jobs.
So you're for the minimum wage increase at some level?
Look, I support Ohio's minimum wage, which happens to be about 10% higher than the federal, and it's indexed to inflation. I actually think it should be indexed to inflation. I think this has become sort of a political exercise every 5 or 10 years where people come to Congress and it's sort of a stair-step thing. And frankly, because of that, the economics of it are much more difficult for employers, because the Democrats come and say, let's raise it dramatically over a relatively short period of time, rather than saying, as we do in Ohio, let's put it to, index it to inflation. Right now we're at 7.95, we'll go up slowly. I think that's a much better approach.
Well, if I have another second on this, I want to ask you about the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. Bret had a point on his program earlier about once again, it's been shown to be somewhat inaccurate, 10 or 12 billion or 13 billion this year in missed payments. At the same time, it's thought to be one of the best instruments the federal government has for reducing poverty. I didn't see it in your speech, but I wonder if you think that's got to be, that's a program, since it was started under President Ford, that Republicans can get behind, where there might be some bipartisan, expanding the EITC, there might be some bipartisan agreement.
Yes, and EITC is a much better approach because it actually deals with people who are working, encourages work, rather than telling employers you've got to pay a certain wage and that'll result in fewer jobs based on the studies. So I do think the EITC is a better approach. The missed payment is also a major issue, though, and if you look at it over the last 10 years, probably 120 billion missed payment. The missed payment rate's probably 20 to 25% versus 3 or 4% for other programs that deal with folks in poverty. So that is an issue. I think there are ways to deal with it. I did talk about that today at AEI, and my proposal was you have an offset of your payroll taxes, so it's done at the employer rather than at the IRS, which I think would make a big difference. But no, I think EITC is a good program. I think the Work Opportunity Tax Credit's a good program, where you're encouraging companies to hire people, whether it's veterans or people who are long-term unemployed, other people who have issues because they have been in and out of the criminal justice system. I think that's a good program, but that leads to employment. And I think that's got to be the key right now, getting more people to work.
More with the panel and Senator Portman. We'll talk foreign policy and politics, of course, after a quick break.
Are you satisfied with the Obama administration's response to the kidnappings of the Nigerian schoolgirls, or should we be doing more than tweeting our outrage? Should we be sending in special forces? What say you?
I'm pleased that they have sent in some American assets, including monitoring assets. As you may know, I started the Human Trafficking Caucus in the Senate, and I've been involved in this issue, and I talked about it today at the speech we talked about. I do think that it's good that they've taken some steps. I would be more aggressive, but I applaud them for what they have done. And it also has helped raise awareness of this issue generally. You know, sex trafficking doesn't just occur in Nigeria or just in Asia. It occurs right here in this country.
The Select Committee for Benghazi, should the Senate play a role, or do
Yes.
you think that the House can handle this?
No, the Senate should play a role. We should have our own select committee. I would prefer it to be bicameral, in other words, have a House and Senate committee working together. I think you've got to get to the bottom of this issue, and I think, frankly, it's in the administration's interest to do that more quickly rather than having it be even closer to a 2016 election, because I think the American people are looking for and deserve answers. And, you know, 4 Americans were left behind, and, you know, we have all kinds of different theories as to why the administration did not say that it was a terrorist attack. We need to find out why and what happened. And then finally, and this is something that I think sometimes we miss, Jason, is the next day the president went out to the Rose Garden and said these people will be brought to justice who committed these terrorist attacks, as he says, although it was talked about terrorism generally. If that's the case, what's happened? Have any of those individuals been brought to justice? The answer is no.
Senator, thank you very much for being on center seat. We'd love to have
Thank
you
you,
back
Bret.
sometime.
Great to
That's it
have
for the panel, but stay tuned to see this. An age-old answer to an age-old question, and it involves Senator Portman.